Well, 2015 was, monumental year. The Great Paris Agreement got uh, signed on by majority of the signatories to the UNFCCC. Few countries have been dancing around, not ratified, etc. So now in 2025, 10 years later, WRI, along with Bezos Earth and ClimateWorks, Race to Resilience, Race to Zero, and WRI, as I mentioned, have all made an assessment of what the state of climate action is now after 10 years. A long way to say it. So it's a longish report. I'm going to just take few high points from the executive summary and then add a couple of more points. Essentially, news is not so great. We still have this idea of no planet B, but there is good news and bad news as usual. A lot of progress on renewables and electrification, electric vehicles, but overall, the curve on emissions is not bending. We have already discussed many times. So, 10 years since the Paris Agreement was signed, this report card on climate action shows that that global efforts across the highest emitting sectors fall far short of what's needed to limit the warming to 1.5 degrees C. 1.5 degrees C, let's leave it, let's not discuss it too much. The agreement was on 2 degrees C and then later modified to 1.5 degrees C because of the concern by some of the states like the Alliance of Small Island and Developing States. So progress is heading in the right direction for most of the 45 indicators assessed. None are really on track to achieve the 2030 targets. Compatible with this temperature goal of 1.5 degrees C. The pace of change is promising, but still too slow for 6 indicators and at well below the required speed for another 29. For 5 of the indicators, trends are heading in the wrong direction entirely and data are insufficient to evaluate the remaining 5. So overall, we can say less bad news is what we can say than mostly good news on anything. Several bright spots underscore that rapid change is possible. We keep saying that it's an optimistic vision, and it's good to hold on to that because everybody is at the table negotiating, revising their nationally determined contributions, national action plans on climate, and generally negotiating. COP30 is coming up soon in Brazil and so on. Private climate finance has increased sharply, shifting from well off track to off track, Solar is the fastest growing power source ever, and the nascent innovations like green hydrogen saw meaningful 1-year gains. So we are scrounging for good news here. So with all these positive changes have occurred alongside far more troubling trends. For electric vehicle sales, the only indicator previously on track growth slowed. The only indicator previously on track growth slowed, such that progress is now off track for 2030 in terms of having to reach the targets by 2030 for the 2100 1.5 degrees C target. Efforts to reduce coal-fired power plants and deforestation remain well off track for multiple installments in a row, and even consistent year-on-year growth in renewables is not enough, as with each passing year the pace of change needed to get on track for 2030 increases, the gap increases. 2024 was a record year for CO2 emissions and coal, so that's not good news. An enormous acceleration in effort is needed to, get there across every sector by 2030. For example, electricity generated from unabated gas needs to be phased out 7 times faster. Declines in deforestation need to accelerate 9-fold, and growth in total climate finance needs to increase 4 times faster. Okay. Halfway through the middle of, so getting to some of the main summary point, I'm being very brief, I'm cutting out a lot of the detailed text. Halfway through the middle of what the climate community has dubbed the decisive decade, urgency is fading, vested interests in maintaining the status quo are playing defense as strongly as ever, and complacency is on the rise. In a particularly notable development this year, the world's second largest emitter and largest historical emitter, the United States, has scaled back climate policies and programs, reduced the scope of environmental agencies, and discontinued long-standing investments in climate science and decarbonization measures. But what is not mentioned here is that this has also served as an excuse for many European countries, including Sweden, which typically being a leader on net zero and so on. Europe is also scaling back on its climate action and its promises, so that's really worrisome. Global greenhouse gas emissions continue to climb, intensifying climatic changes and impacts that are already more severe and widespread than anticipated. These worsening climate impacts lay bare countries' plural collective failure to act at the pace and scale required to combat the crisis, but that doesn't necessarily mean that efforts are not underway. A decade ago, the Paris Agreement was adopted with the shared goal of putting humanity on a more sustainable path, not only averting climate impacts, but also advancing energy security, safeguarding ecosystem services, improving human health, and enhancing overall well-being. This year, parties to the Paris Agreement have the chance to step up ambitions further still and submit new NDCs that will determine the global emissions trajectory through 2035, which is a critical time horizon as well to stay on track. Far steeper and more rapid GHG emissions reductions are needed immediately to keep the Paris Agreement within reach. How are we going to get there is not clear. Many conflicts still going on, and US has backtracked on many things, as we said. In spite of these grave challenges, and indeed precisely because collective efforts are so far behind, achieving 1.5 degree C-aligned sectoral targets is all the more vital. It's in the parties' interests to step up climate ambition and action to secure their tremendous and myriad benefits. We still have a small window of time not to avoid all impacts, but rather to limit harm to people and ecosystems, but we must use it wisely and act with the urgency this moment demands. Looking at some figures and continuing with the not so great news, rapid growth in electric vehicle, passenger car sales share, solar and wind generation share, and the ratio of investment in low carbon to fossil fuel energy supply since 2015. Share of electric vehicles in light duty vehicles percentage 2024 data up 22%. This is share of electric vehicles in light duty vehicles sales, not overall. Share of solar and wind electricity generation up to 15% in 2024. Is that enough? Typically, you would look for how much of the new demand is being met by renewables so that fossil fuels can begin to be phased out, or at least new ones not be commissioned, so that we are not locking into fossil fuel more and more. But news is mixed, obviously. Ratio of investment in low carbon to fossil fuel energy supply is 1.1 to 1, so barely making a dent overall, but you can say, well, it's been up over time. Okay, here is some here are some numbers on global net anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions by sector in 2023. Data tends to be behind. Electricity, 15, electricity and heat. So maybe we should start here. Global greenhouse gas emissions, when you include non-CO2 greenhouse gases, is 56.6 gigaton CO2 equivalent in 2023, which is bad news. It obviously went up. 2024 was even worse. Energy was 21%. Agriculture, forestry, and other land uses, AFOLU as we call it, 10.1. Industry, 11.5. Transport, 8.4. Buildings, 3.6. And waste was around 2. And electricity and heat was 15.1 when you go out to the next levels, and out of that buildings and industries made up about similar amounts. In AFOLU, land use change and forestry and enteric fermentation accounted for 3.6 and 3.2 each, whereas in the industry, industrial processes and fuel combustion accounted for 5.1 and 6.5. And you have, of course, under buildings also residential, non-residential, and other. In the transport, you have road transports and the rest, and you have various other items like coal mining, oil and gas fugitive emissions, petroleum refining, etc. And the main story is still that we are really not bending the curve, and carbon capture and sequestration haven't scaled up to even get a good mention. Okay, what has changed since the State of Climate Action 2023? Let's read that a little bit. Since the last installment of this report series, 4 indicators statuses have changed. Electric buses have experienced a course correction since Bohm et al. 2023. That's the report, with global scale shifting from heading in the wrong direction to heading in the right direction, but well off track still, and so on. So basically, little things, and overall not much. So while most indicators overall statuses have not shifted since 2023, many have seen progress accelerate or decelerate marginally. Of all indicators that were included in both reports and have sufficient data, approximately a third had acceleration factors that improved, such that required rates of future change are now lower. So we are just saying we don't need to accelerate so much, but we still need to accelerate. So basically less bad news than any good news. So in recent years, cement's carbon intensity has begun to decline thanks to alternative fuels, substituting clinker with other materials, and increased efficiency. Now getting on track for 2030 entails a 4-fold acceleration, which is better than before. However, for another quarter of these indicators, progress has occurred too slowly, which means that future change must occur even faster to keep 1.5 degrees C aligned targets within reach. So you can look up the appendix for that. They define this S-curve thing, which they look for in buildings, transportation, power generation, and so on. That I'll show one or two and then jump to conclusions. Here, for example, if you look at time and you look at the illustrative S-curve going here from 0 to 100%, you have the emergence stage, breakthrough stage, diffusion stage, and then reconfiguration of the system. Annual growth may look slow here, and during breakthrough you begin to have a drop, and then during the reconfiguration you have gone towards 100% reconfiguration. So diffusion stage is really important for the S-curve here. So what are we talking about? Exponential growth. Although annual growth rates are high, the S-curve appears flat since its starting point for technology adoption is low. Exponential growth here, the S-curve becomes evident, so it's flat here, becomes evident. The absolute amount of growth each year increases, but the growth rate starts to decay, so it begins to slow. Exponential growth here in the diffusion period, transitioning into logarithmic growth, absolute growth increases, and the S-curve reaches the maximum steepness, the growth rate continues to decay. Overall you are on the trajectory, but growth rate has had its maximum. Logarithmic growth rates gradually approach 0 until the S-curve once again appears to flat as before. So this is the S-curve that they discuss and see which ones have reached the S-curve and so on. So I will be brief about this, take a few of them. Summary of global progress towards the power targets, that sector being looked at with historical trends being looked at from 2010 to 2022, and then if you extrapolate the past trends, news is not good, but here is starting with 2024 data and what the S-curve would look like and it looks likely here. And this is for share of zero carbon sources in electricity generation. We are looking at historical data, extension of the current data, and pace needed to reach targets to hit the S curve. Share of solar and wind in electricity generation. This is also trying to see if whether we are in the right direction and well off track, or we are just not on track at all and in the wrong direction, and so on. So for share of solar and wind, the trend extrapolated will not be very encouraging for the S curve, but S curve needs to go here. By 2035, it needs to hit 68 to 86% of electricity generation, whereas here, share of zero carbon sources need to hit 96% in 2035 for coal in electricity generation. So share of coal in electricity generation is, sorry, that's the next one. I cut it off the wrong way here. Share of coal in electricity generation, we were headed in the right direction, but well off track. So you are extrapolating, you're going here, and 2024 has been a record year for coal at 34% here, and you have to go down by 2030, and then by 2035 we want to hit zero. So acceleration required to reach 2030 targets is 10 times. Is it possible? Not looking very promising right now. Share of unabated fossil gas in electricity generation, again, right direction but off track, right direction but well off track as well in terms of carbon intensity of electricity generation, and we need to accelerate by 10 times to hit the 2030 target. So power generation, we already know that it looks like great news when you look at prices dropping on solar and wind and deployment and the number of implemented power capacities in renewables, but overall, when you compare the entire portfolio, fossil fuels, gas, oil, coal still remain a big part. So if you look at zero carbon sources in global electricity generation, nuclear, so this is up to 2024, hydro, other renewables, wind and solar, so that's generation of just over 12,000 terawatt hours, but share of generation in percentages remains totally about less than 40%, which means the non-zero carbon sources are greater than 50%. Okay, so, and nuclear has taken a dip here for various reasons because of countries like Germany backtracking after Fukushima, etc. Top 10 countries decarbonizing electricity generation the fastest, as a way to give kudos to those who are trying. Small countries, but still United Arab Emirates, Chile, Portugal, Greece, Belarus, Bulgaria, Estonia, Netherlands, Poland, El Salvador, and the world as a whole. World, what needs to be on track for 1.5 degrees C, 24 to 30 is minus 68. So average annual change over 2019 to 24 in terms of gigaton CO2 equivalent per kilowatt hour needs to be minus 68. Reduce that share of electricity generation by these countries is in terms of gas, coal and gas, gas, coal, coal, oil share, etc. So should we be happy that they are reducing coal? Any progress is good if it's in the right direction. Can always say it's not fast enough, but it's good overall. Increase that share of electricity generation. They did it with nuclear and solar, solar and wind, hydro, and solar and hydro, etc. So those are the top countries which get some mention in terms of electricity generation being the fastest in terms of decarbonizing it. Okay, what is the global progress towards building targets? Again, looking at historical data, extension of current trends, and pace needed to hit targets by 2030 and 2035. Energy intensity of building operations, right direction, well off track. We need to accelerate 3 times. S-curve is basically unlikely. You remember here, S-curve possible in these cases, but likely and possible, but here unlikely. Okay, so we need to go 80 to 110 kilowatt hours per meter squared by 2035 to hit the targets of 1.5 degrees C or Paris Agreement. Carbon intensity of building operations, again, right direction, well off track, and S-curve is still possible here, but we need 4 times the acceleration to reach the 2030 targets. Retrofitting rate of buildings is not much data historically speaking, but this is where you need to go. S-curve is unlikely here, and S-curve is possibly here in terms of share of new buildings that are zero carbon in operation, but there is no historical data, so we are basically expecting things to happen, being optimistic, because here data is insufficient for historical analysis. Okay. Summary of global progress towards industrial industry targets. Right direction, well off track. S-curve possible, S-curve possible. 5 times the acceleration needed for electricity industry sector to go renewable, and here a carbon intensity of global cement production has to accelerate 4 times to hit the 2030 targets, and S-curve is possible. So these are kind of, if we do everything right, S-curve is possible, but we haven't been doing anything right. So how will we get there now? What incentivization can we put in place for collective action? Carbon intensity of global steel production, again, wrong direction, U-turn needed. It's been going up historically and expected to go up, and we need to go way down. Green hydrogen production is S-curve likely, right direction, well off track, and needs to go super exponentially because it hasn't had any positive trend over the last 15 years, let's say. Okay. Cumulative number of announced projects globally for low carbon cement and steel and green hydrogen, CCUS and cement projects, so full scale projects and other projects together. 80 calcined clay cement projects, this clinker replacement kind of things. Again, hardly 25 projects here in 2024 in terms of full scale projects. So we have to look at these because we are feeling very optimistic about participation of the countries, but overall news is not so great. Low carbon steel projects to phase out blast furnace based production, so full scale projects and others. 2024 about 40. Looking at hydrogen production in millions tons of hydrogen per year, green hydrogen projects become operational cumulatively. Almost flattened already by, it's growing from 2025 and then expected to flatten. These are projections, so you have to be careful about what assumptions are made in doing those. Plus, is hydrogen going to be part of the overall system of renewables? It's still not clear. And whether hydrogen will be green or white hydrogen will keep growing, or whether it will remain gray and so on, has to be seen, blue, gray, etc. Right? So let's jump to conclusions. I'll just look at one chart, which is a nice summary. Summary of progress toward 2030 targets. Global climate action is falling short. No indicator is on track for 2030. So private climate finance here reached a record of 1.3 trillion in 2023. Though impressive, these funds need to increase 1.8 times faster. So you have indicator on track, off track, well off track, wrong direction, and insufficient data. And the matrix here is basically looking at the share of solar and wind in electricity generation has more than tripled since 2015, yet growth still needs to more than double to reach its 2030 targets for 1.5. Deforestation levels are far too high, roughly equal to permanently losing nearly 22 football fields of forest every minute in 2024, even though there was a lot of good news in 2024 in terms of reduced deforestation and increased forest cover. Trips taken by passenger cars, most still get gasoline powered, trips taken by passenger cars, most still gasoline powered, now make up about half of all distance traveled, which has to change. So you can see the color is basically saying we are well off track on all these things. Available estimates show an area of peatlands roughly the size of Kenya are degrading and releasing centuries of stored carbon, so insufficient data in most cases, but mostly in the wrong direction for most of the cases. Okay, so for 2030. So we are, unfortunately, not much good news, but the fact that we are monitoring, verifying and reporting says that we can still hold countries responsible in terms of their NDC commitments and their accomplishments in that direction. Many take credits for doing one thing or the other, but you have to track all of them. So renewables are doing great in some countries, but not so much on reducing coal production and consumption, for example, etc., or electrification of the transport system, buildings consumption, cement and steel production, etc., etc. Okay, so this is always going to be 2 step forward, 1 step back kind of a dance, as I've written elsewhere, but you just have to feel that everybody is trying hard. So we need game changers in terms of technologies like improved solar cell efficiencies or overall decarbonization and generally enhanced carbon capture or bioenergy, etc., etc. Okay, let's leave it here.